Hey, I'm Harry, and thank you for checking out my first YouTube video. Please do me a favor and like, share, and subscribe. Now, history books in your average American school or your favorite bookstore shelves gives a curated, romanticized version of history that normally has been replacing the truth with agreed upon lies. What if I was to tell you that the Olmec Society of Mexico, the Adena culture of the Ohio Valley, and the mound builder societies of the Southeast interacted with each other over 2,500 years prior to Columbus even coming to the Americas? Or that the Roman Empire never truly collapsed, but lives on through many of the powerful nations today? Or what if I was to tell you that the enslavement of the indigenous Americans, who would become known as the American Indians, were the major source of slaves in the United States and not Africans, although mainstream media will say otherwise? Stick around and I'll show you how everything we think we know about most cultures didn't actually come from them at all, but mainly their enemies who subdued them through conquest, and how the Catholic Church was at the center of history's most pivotal moments, and much more with Untold History with Harry. When it comes to world history, you can't fully understand the rise of one empire without understanding the fall of the empire that gave rise to it. From the fall of the Akkadian Empire, where Anu and Enki were of vast importance, came rise of the kingdom of Ur, home of the biblical patriarch Abram, better known as Abraham, followed by the Babylonian Empire, where Hammurabi and his codes would be the law of the land. Then the Hittites and the Assyrians, who would build the biblical city of Nineveh, famous for the story of Jonah and the whale. After that would come Nebuchadnezzar II and the Chaldean Empire, who fell to the Persians. But then shortly after that, you had Alexander of Macedonia, better known as Alexander the Great. All of these former empires would pave the way for Rome to take center stage, and just 230 years after the supposed fall of Rome, the Islamic caliphates who would become known as the Moors, would have taken over the Iberian Peninsula, formerly a part of the western region of the Roman Empire, which would soon be known as Hispania. And if that word sounds familiar, it's because the word Hispanic comes from Hispania. The Catholic monarchs would wage a war that would become known as the Reconquista and would kick off the Age of Exploration, which would change the world forever. Now, this isn't a religious podcast by any means. However, due to the deep connection of world history and religion, we will discuss to a degree. And with that being said, in the book of Exodus, chapter 3, verse 8, it states, "And I come down to deliver them out of the hands of the Egyptians, and bring them up out of that land into a good land, and a large into land flowing with milk and honey, unto the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, and the Amorites, and the Pezerites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites." Now, who are these groups of people mentioned dwelling in the Fertile Crescent? These people would all fall under the Canaanite or Semitic speaking umbrella. This region would be seen as the cradle of civilization, boasting prolific groups such as the Sumerians, Akkadians, Assyrians, Phoenicians, and Babylonians. Now, during this time, when this area seemed to be the major focus of mainstream history, across the world in the Americas, the southern portion to be exact, as the Americas was and still is one landmass. In fact, the idea of them being two separate continents didn't take hold until the 1700s. Till this day, you can actually still drive from the top of North America down to South America. Granted, there's 100-mile stretch of dense jungle and swampland known as the Darien Gap, filled with mountains, rivers, deadly animals, along with armed groups, which would make traveling through this destination not the smartest decision if driving cross country is your thing. But in the Americas, during the age of cradle of civilizations, you had the Karasupe, who were ancestors of the Quechua speaking people of the Andes. They were thriving with a vast trade network of their own, having similar growth spurts as the more well known societies. Now, Karasupe is said to be only second to Mesopotamia, thriving alongside ancient Kemet, ancient China, and the ancient Indus Valley region, but even older than Karasupe would be the site of Okmulgee in the modern day state of Georgia, which was said to be inhabited as early as 15,000 years ago. Now, if we're being technical, at some point there were life everywhere. And it's just that those places no longer are in existence, and most times due to purposeful destructions by later societies, almost in an attempt to conceal the ancient past and disconnect it from current times. But I digress. Back to the land of milk and honey, where ancient civilizations were developing and the population started to grow, so much that the need for protection, food, and support grew as well. Things that individual families would create for themselves, such as clothes, blankets, pottery, and so on, would need to be produced on higher levels. Now, this would be to support trade and to supplement those of the population who can't make their own for whatever reason. Now, from this, these city states would not only have military ties and support each other through times of war, they would also be united through marriages. Now, over time, this would create kingdoms or empires. And in the future generation, in which technically speaking, we would be the future generations, we would call these kingdoms great empires. And for instance, we would talk about the Achaemenid Empire, which was one of the last great empires of that region to be ran by its indigenous people, also known as the First Persian Empire. Cyrus the Great would be dubbed the founder of that empire that stretched from Anatolia, which is modern Turkey today, to Mesopotamia, Central Asia, near Afghanistan, the Indus Valley, the Caucasus, and the Arabian Peninsula. Cyrus would practice the trend of sparing his enemies and giving them the autonomy to practice their native customs as long as they became tributaries to the empire and give the military support when called upon. With that, they would in return receive perks of being a part of that empire, which would help keep revolts down to a minimum if done right. And as we will see throughout history, more times than not, it wasn't done right. Now, before the Canaanites were absorbed into the First Persian Empire, they were known as the first Hyksos or foreigners to rule Kemet, ended their reign of indigenous rule of the ancient Lower Egypt around the year 1650 BC. That was about 150 years of the Hyksos being settled in the Nile Delta region. The native Egyptians would still rule southern Egypt, and Ahmose first would defeat the foreigners, bringing in what would be known as the New Kingdom of Egypt. This would actually be one of the more powerful eras in their history. They would soon be taken over again by the Libyans and the Nubians around the year 1079 BC, although they basically assimilated, and by they, the Nubians and Libyans, basically assimilated into Egyptian culture, but we will still count this as them being conquered. After them, the Neo Assyrians would also conquer, and for them, I use air quotes when using the word conquer, but it wasn't until the first Persian Empire where Egypt became a satrapy, governed by outsiders. The indigenous from that point on would never rule their lands again, as after the Persian Empire came Alexander the Great. Now, essentially, Kemet was not Kemet for a very long time, around the year 332 BC. So, when you see these Hollywood depictions or historical narratives where the ruling class are more European like, that's really not a stretch, as the ruling class has been outsiders, like I just mentioned, for a very long time. But much on that a bit later. To put the timeline of the Achaemenid Empire in perspective, the Canaanites would have already been conquered by the Babylonians, meaning that the kingdom of Judah, if you're familiar with the 12 tribes of Israel, Judah and Benjamin split from the remaining 10 tribes who became the kingdom of Israel, with their capital being in Samaria. And by that point, they would have already been in captivity. Now, King Solomon would have been dead for about 300 years, and the remaining 10 tribes, as said, would have already been dispersed. Now, this would have been with the Assyrians having them in captivity, and this would also be where they received the moniker Lost Tribes, as they were dispersed and never again to be in their homeland. Now, the first Persian pharaoh of Egypt would be the son of Cyrus the Great, Cambyses II. The reasoning for this conqueror is rather interesting, more embarrassing on its end, which technically, I guess, in his mind was justified for his actions. Now, wanting to initially make an alliance with Egypt, and for the sake of familiarity, we will use the term Egypt, although during this actual time period, that name was not used, as Egyptus or Egypt was the Greek name for the land. Now, Cambius was promised the Pharaoh's daughter hand in marriage, but instead of Hamo's second sending his daughter, he sends the daughter of Wahibre Haibre, the former Pharaoh of Egypt's daughter Natitus. Now, let's skip the fact that this request came from a disgruntled member of Hamo's own court. He knew that the Pharaoh would not go through with it, knowing that his daughter would just become a concubine of sort or a minor wife. Some can see this as fate, as Wahibre, known to the Greeks as King Apries or Hophra in the biblical book of Jeremiah, chapter 44, verse 30, for those who are interested. It speaks of Pharaoh Hophra being given into the hands of his enemies, who seeks his life, as if the king of Judah who was given into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. And this is where Old Testament scriptures captured what was going on during that time period. During the life of Jeremiah, who was a prophet from the kingdom of Judah, born in Anathoth, modern Palestinian town of Anata, which was about 3 miles from Jerusalem. Now, Jeremiah is known for warning Judah that because of their idolatry and disobedience, and you will see that this would be a long standing history trend with the Israelites, just to say the least, but that this would lead to the Babylonian conquering them and exiling them. Now, after the siege of Jerusalem, a number of Judeans fled to Egypt as a safe haven. He warned them that Egypt could not protect them from the wrath of God, and he tells how Egypt protected them and gave them bread and water and wool in abundance, but that Egypt too would fall, and that because they were former lovers, now this was literal and figurative, because Egypt and the kingdom of Judah not only had military ties and alliances several times throughout history, but the Pharaoh during the time before the split, when it was just the kingdom of Israel, Pharaoh would give his daughter to Solomon, and along with that, a lot of their ways would integrate into Judea. Now, not only would he have given his daughter to Solomon, but he would also conquer a Canaanite city as a wedding gift. Now, because of all of this and the idolatry, Jeremiah warned that siding with Wahibra against Babylon would not be wise, and as history shows, Egypt was conquered. Now, due to Egypt's heavy involvement in the affairs of Mesopotamia, the native Egyptian soldiers' relationships with Wahibra started to sour. This will lead to his regiment of soldiers from Aswan to mutiny against him for having them go to Libya, which was already Greek, as Cyrene was called Athens of Libya, as it was founded by the ancestors of the Spartans, known as the Dorians, in the year 631 BC. Now, they were to go and assist the Greeks from an invasion of Cyrene, in which they were defeated badly. Now, tensions between the native Egyptian warriors and their Greek mercenaries, their allies, I should say, came to a dangerous level in which General Ahmose had to pacify them. A civil war would break out, and Wahibre Habre was killed, and Ahmose was made pharaoh. Egypt also had Greek soldiers from Caria and Ionia, as well as other parts. Now, Phanes and Halicarnassus, a Greek mercenary hired by Ahmose. Now, we have to realize that a huge portion of Egypt's military were outsiders, but they fell out of favor with Ahmose, and he would left to seek out Cambyses II, who was planning to invade Egypt. Now, Phanes provided necessary intelligence for the Persians to defeat the Egyptians, as well as advised him to request permission of passage from the king of Arabia, who was also an enemy of Ahmose and provided supplies and soldiers in this conflict, but needed to get that passage from Gaza to Pelusium. Now, not to harp on this too much, but Phanes was not just a regular soldier, but a highly praised and skilled soldier who was respected in the ancient Greek world. Now, if Egypt was to stand a chance against Persia, he would have needed to be on their side to be relied upon, and him switching sides sealed the fate of Egypt. Now, Amos would die before the Persians arrived, and in an attempt to show his power, his son Sametink III gave Phanes an even greater reason to make sure Egypt is no more. His sons were arrested and killed by the Egyptians, having their blood mixed with wine before it was consumed. Now, this was around the time where the city that is now called Memphis in Egypt, whose name was actually called Menifer by the native Egyptians, were destroyed and pretty much forgotten until the French presence by way of, you guessed it, Napoleon. But that's for another video in the future. So stick around to see the web of connections throughout world history. Now, around the time of the Persian invasion of Egypt, the Maya had cities that were now centuries old, major temple complexes, major trade networks, staple crops, and a form of writing known as hieroglyphs, almost like the Egyptians were said to have. And if I didn't know any better, I would say that one was influenced by the other. But that would be absurd, right? Maybe, maybe not. But just to dig a tad bit deeper, it is said that ancient Egypt used the Ankh as early as 3100 BC. Now, that's about 2,500 years before the site in Mexico where the symbol was found. The plot twist is until the year 1822, when Champollion translated the Rosetta Stone, no one could read Egyptian hieroglyphs. The French, along with some German and British scholars, along with Napoleon and other groups known as the Savants of the Commission des Sciences et des Arts, who were, by the way, was a group of 160 French scholars, engineers, artists, mathematicians, historians, who dated, cataloged, and created everything that is known about ancient Egypt. Now, even the concept of the 30 dynasties weren't ancient Kemetic knowledge, but a list that was created by a priest of the Ptolemaic era of Greek origin. Now, I say all of this to say that the dating of a lot of the things regarding ancient Egypt was provided by the French and British as well. And since a lot of the actual ancient information was lost to time, in fact, it is said that as early as 500 BC, that hieroglyphs were not widely used in Egypt, and by 30 BC, the time of Roman rule, it wasn't used at all outside of religious ritual uses. But in Mexico, not only was hieroglyphs being used and read during 500 BC, the Maya, however, were also able to read and write in hieroglyphs at the time of Spanish contact. Anyway, I'm sure that means absolutely nothing. Around this time, the ancestors of the Inca were trading coca to Egypt and beyond as Henutawi, a priestess of the Temple of Amun, who was known as Maya, no pun intended, and this was also the sister of Wahibre. Her mummy was said to have cocaine and nicotine inside, two things that were exclusive to the Americas. Now, in fact, the Ankh mentioned earlier that is commonly associated with ancient Egypt. Well, it can be found at the site of Calixtlahuaca, near the state of Toluca in Mexico, which was, you guessed it, founded around the year 500 BC by the Matlanzinca and other Atomi related groups. Now, the ancient Egyptian symbol was lost to time and rediscovered and brought back to prominence in the deciphering of the Rosetta Stone in 1822 by the French. There goes Napoleon again. Now, during the ancient world, many nations created alliances by way of diplomatic marriages, giving gifts and their daughters hand in marriage. This would keep a semi steady relationship between Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Mitanni, and other nations. Now, Cambyses fell out of favor with the Egyptians due to many reasons, and even though conquering nations would be the fastest way to spread culture besides direct trading, it's also one of the easiest ways to build that type of animosity, which Cambyses did. Now, this would drive his people to welcome his enemy as their savior, to liberate them, even if it meant losing even more autonomy than you had before. Now, that savior would be none other than Alexander the Great. Macedonia at this time was just a vassal state of the Persian Empire, and prior to Philip II of Macedonia, it was an afterthought of the different Greek city states. By defeating the Greek coalition, Philip formed an alliance with them with the goal of invading the Persian Empire. Now, dying before this can become a reality, his son Alexander would make those ambitions a reality. Tutored from childhood to about the age of 16 by none other than Aristotle, student of Socrates and the father of Western philosophy, it's not hard to understand why he was as gifted and strategic as he was. The interesting thing to note, however, with the great philosophers of ancient Greek world is that it all started with Thales, founder of the Know Thyself saying. Now, Thales was a student of the Egyptian priest himself, as Miletus had a permanent port colony in Egypt. Greece also had colonies in other areas, such as Tripoli and tongue tie, Cyrenaicacia, and I may be pronouncing that wrong, but it is spelled Cyrenacia for those who would like to take a look at that for themselves. Now, this was actually the birthplace of hedonism. This means that the greatest minds to come out of Greece would have to give credit to Egypt, who would also have to give credit in return to those before them. Now, by the year 332 BC, Alexander had taken over Egypt without the need for battle. And the following year, the city of Alexandria was founded where Rhodotus once stood. This was the start of the Hellenistic period of Egypt and the birth of the Ptolemaic kingdom. This is where the era of Canaanite culture would merge with the Akkadians, whose culture would merge with the ancient Egyptians and other cultures of that area and fall under the sphere of influence of the Persians. This would give Egypt a Greek facelift. Now, this is also where you will start seeing similar deities and pantheons throughout that region of the world and the birth of mythologies that seem to merge several cultures. An example of this would be the cult of Serapis. Now, Serapis was a Greco Egyptian god, modeling after the early Egyptian god Osiris, who was the god of fertility, agriculture, life, and death, and Apis, the sacred bull known as the son of Hathor, and who acted as a middleman between humans and Ta, Osiris, Atun, and is associated with Iris, the sister and wife of Osiris. Another comparison would be with Zeus. Now, the intention of all of this was just to unify Greek and Egyptian subjects of Ptolemy. This narrative seems to be as old as time itself, taking over an area while slowly making your culture the norm, while allowing your new subjects to practice theirs until it somehow meshes. into the new order of things. Another trend that would become widespread was the marrying of the princess of the defeated empire and making her your concubine or your wife or minor wife for strategic purposes, if I had to guess. Now, Alexander the Great would die around 323 BC, and because he left no heirs, this would cause infighting among his generals. Now, after the wars, his generals ruled their empires. Now, the Hellenistic empires that came out of the splits would be the Ptolemaic kingdom, ruled by Ptolemy of Soter, the Seleucid Empire, and the Antigonian kingdom. Now, although the Ptolemaic kingdom is better known, the Seleucid Empire was the largest out of the three, spanning between modern Turkey, Persia, and India, and lasted about 300 years. The Ptolemaic era would go on to produce the infamous Cleopatra, last ruler of the Ptolemaic period, and the drama of her life's exploits unfolded, ending with Egypt becoming a possession of Rome after Octavian became victorious during the Battle of Actium. Cleopatra's life would be cut short around 30 BC. Now, Rome would defeat the other empires and absorb them into their growing empire. Rome would defeat Philip of Macedon, increasing their influence in the Mediterranean, especially Greece. Now, the Seleucid Empire was absorbed as well and forced to sign the Treaty of Apamea in the year 188 BC. Now, several components that came as a result of the Roman Seleucid Wars that will be discussed in detail later, as the consequences left a major mark on history. The Punic Wars, which happened between 264 to 146 BC, was between Carthage and Rome and increased Rome's power and influence. The end of the First Punic War ended with Carthage giving up Sicily to Rome. The end of the Second ended with the Phoenicians, or Canaanite, or Canaanites as they called themselves, owing Rome even more payments for losses incurred and the loss of even more overseas territories, such as Sardinia, Corsica, Spain, and the Iberia region. These were territories where Carthage would lose. Now, Nova, such as, or would be known as Cartagena, Spain. Now, the end of the Third Punic War saw the destruction of the city state of Carthage and the enslavement of their people throughout the Roman Empire. Not to take away from the incredible feats of the general commander Hannibal Barca or his father Hamilcar, as they were extraordinary strategists and had major victories against Rome in several battles. A major factor on why Rome was able to be successful was simply their ability to raise new armies after huge defeats, in which the Carthaginians were not able to do. Although one can argue the point that for a point in time, Rome was just a subject of the Etruscan Empire. Now, Rome would grow to become an empire to be reckoned with on its own, taking over a huge piece of the landmass which unified northern Africa, the Levant, the majority of what we would call Europe, and Asia Minor, although a lot of that region would fall to the Islamic civilizations. Now, a lot of civil violence would erupt, and due to issues of the elite gaining major land holdings of conquered territories, while their veteran allies and not so elite were left with nothing. Issues with their allies, such as the different Italian communities, were not able to become citizens or cast votes or hold office, which would cause strife and conflict, which ended with Rome granting them citizenship. As all of the world's civilizations started to lose power, out of nowhere would come the Romans, now introduced to the world in the New Testament as a force to be reckoned with already, leaving their humble beginnings out of history. But like every empire, they would have covered, and every empire that we will cover, there would be a time where civil war would usher in a new era of rule, and for Rome, that would be around 49 BC, in which Augustus Caesar would become the first emperor, marking the start of the Roman Empire and the end of the Roman Republic. Now, although Caesar was dubbed the first emperor, the founding of Rome as a city and a kingdom is credited to Romulus, who was the twin brother of Remus, Now, there's a common theme in most civilizations' legends that involve twins. Now, this would include Horus and Set of ancient Kemet, the hero twins of the ancient Maya, the hero twins of the ancient Mississippian culture, the twins of Sapling and Flint for the Iroquois, the ancient Sioux legend of the Red Horn's sons. Now, this is just to name a few. However, Roman lists would go on to become associated with the cult of Quirinalia before it fell into obscurity for other cults, and before Emperor Theodosius the Great made Christianity or Catholicism their official religion around 380 CE, which took on different traits of the several past religions within the empire. Now, after Judea was conquered during the First Jewish Roman War in 63 BC by the Roman general Pompey the Great, he set up Hyrcanus II as the Judean high priest. With every defeat, the Israelites would face changes in the ways that they worship. When they were conquered by the Babylonians, the great Temple of Solomon was destroyed, and that's where the transition was made from temple worship to synagogue worship. When Hyrcanus dealt with the Seleucids and Hyrcanus the First dealt with the Seleucids, more changes were done as they were forced to convert the Edomians, which were a group of Edomites, descendants of Esau. Among other things, Alexander the Great conquest would give them a heavy Hellenistic influence, in which their religion was now beginning to adopt and be influenced by the Greek. Now, this would also be the reason why the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek and how major tensions were caused, which resulted in the Maccabean revolt. As Antiochus went on a campaign of spreading Hellenistic ideas within his territories in ways by no standards were nice, he would meet opposition in Judea. Now, around a decade and some change earlier, the father of Antiochus would meet defeat by the Romans, which would have left his son with a weakened empire. Wanting to create a oneness within his territory, he began pushing the integration of Greek customs within Jewish populations. Not only was a Greek god erected in the Jewish temple, pigs were sacrificed on the temple's altar, and the Jewish temple was defiled. Now, honestly, I don't know what Antiochus thought the reactions of the Jewish people would be, but he had to know deep down inside that they would not accept these acts just laying down. Now, the high priest at the time, Menelaus, would steal sacred items as well as gold and silver from the temple, angering the Jews. Now, Menelaus was a part of the Hellenistic Jew population, Jews who basically adopted Greek customs and after being conquered by Alexander the Great. Now, these Jews would become a large part of the Sadducees class, who would war against the Pharisees, who adhered to a strict form of their law. On top of the turmoil brewing and the tensions that were rising, you had religious persecutions and forced repressions of culture and the observance of their Sabbath. After refusing to give a forced offering to Greek gods, a Jewish priest, Mattathias, ended up killing a Seleucid official along with a Jew who accepted the pagan commands. This would set off a guerrilla war between the priest, his sons, along with other Jews who joined their cause, versus the military force of the weakened Seleucid Empire and their allies. The Jewish guerrilla forces would be successful in retaking Jerusalem and overthrowing all Hellenistic influence as well as restoring the temple. Now, the temple restoration would be the birth of the Hanukkah celebration. With future battles and other misunderstandings, the Jews would obtain their autonomy, and the Maccabees family would become high priests by order of the Seleucids. The Romans would eventually take over the Seleucid territory of Judea in 63 BC, as the Seleucids never recovered from their battles with Rome and would be absorbed. A little over 100 years earlier, the northern kingdom of Israel, Syrian region, was taken over by the Romans. Now, the former inhabitants, also known as the 10 tribes of Israel, were removed after their captivity by the Assyrians, and now the Seleucid territory was occupied by Greeks and other native tribes of people. Over time, the Romans would be weakened by the Visigoths and other Germanic groups. And Rome, I mean the Western Rome, as Eastern Rome thrived for over 1,000 years after Western Rome had fallen, ending with defeat of the Byzantine. And the term Byzantine was not used in real time by its citizens, as they always referred to themselves as Romans because they were still Rome. However, they would be conquered in the year 1453 by the Ottomans. And so we're going to take a break from here and we will continue with the story on my next segment. But I hope you enjoy